Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's Environmental Finance Centered Network training. We'll be exploring how to manage, value, and invest in natural assets. I'm Caroline Cook, the Policy Director at WaterNow, and we are delighted that you've joined us. So before we get started, I'll just go over quickly some of the functionality of the webinar, which I'm sure folks are familiar with at this point. But just as a reminder, you'll be able to submit your questions for our speakers today through the Q&A box you see there on the screen. And then if do know that somebody might respond in writing in the Q&A box, so keep an eye on that. And then if you have questions or technical challenges, you can ask us those through the chat function, and we will help you troubleshoot. And I will note that we'll be sharing out the slides from today and a recording of today's program. So stay tuned for that. As another housekeeping note, while this session has not been pre-approved for continuing education credits, you will receive a certificate of attendance following the program, so long as you stay on for the whole webinar. You're using your real name and a unique email that you use to sign up for the program, and you're going to participate in some polls that are coming up. So that certificate will come from EFCN in about a month or so. So speaking of EFCN, the Environmental Finance Center Network is a university and nonprofit-based organization creating innovative solutions for the difficult how-to-pay issues of environmental protection and water infrastructure. And WaterNow is very pleased to be part of that network. And one last housekeeping note here is that we'll be sharing a feedback slide um, for getting your input about the survey at the end of the program. So thanks for filling that out and helping us improve these trainings as we go. And for those viewers who aren't familiar with our organization, WaterNow, on our next slide here, is a nonprofit network for local water decision makers, advancing sustainable, affordable, and resilient water solutions across the One Water spectrum. So, what brings us here today? We've got four objectives we can see on our next slide for our hour together. One is to demonstrate that natural assets are part of water systems that can be managed and invested in alongside other assets. Two is to feature how utilities can use state revolving fund loans to pay for natural asset investments. Third, our objective is to share with you what technical assistance is available to secure funding for natural asset projects. And fourth, last but not least, is to answer your questions that you have about these topics. So I'll introduce our speakers in just a moment, but let's take a look at our agenda. Um, First, we're going to ask you some audience polls, as I mentioned. From there, we will cover, to help meet our objectives, what we mean when we say natural assets. And we'll also share some thoughts on how to manage, value, and invest in these systems. As I mentioned, next from there, I'll provide an overview of how natural assets are eligible for SRFs, and highlight those technical assistance programs you can use to access that funding. And as I mentioned as well, we'll give you all some time at the end for Q&A. So speaking of our speakers, we've got a great lineup of folks. I really appreciate you all joining us. Janet Clements and Jeff Odefee with One Water Econ, Heather Hemmelberger from the Southwest Environmental Finance Center, Bob Rauscher, a seasoned water resource economist, Ed Harrington, the former general manager for the San Francisco PUC and a municipal finance expert. And as I mentioned, I'm Caroline, the policy director for WaterNow. Thanks again for you all for being here. So before I hand it over to Jeff, we've reached our polls. So we're going to use Menti, I think. And we're going to put that information in the chat here in just a moment. But we can also put it, uh, it's at menti.com. All right, there we go. Thanks, Jesse. Um, so you can go to menti.com and put in this code 1403-8863 or scan that QR code to use it on your phone. And I see people are getting in there now. So we're curious, what industry association best describes you? Are you a city council member, tribal government officer, special district board member? We've got lots of utility management, our staff folks, some state agency folks here, some NGO, academics, our private sector and consultants are well represented today. Welcome, everyone. Give folks a moment more to fill this out. All right, looks like our responses are slowing down a little bit. Got one commissioner from a utility. All right. So it looks like we've got a good mix of folks, lots of utility staff. You're in the right place, everybody, to learn a bit more about natural assets. So I'll go to our next poll, Jesse, if this one's going to work. So for those utility folks and those serving public agencies, we're curious, how many customers are you serving? We've got some folks here more than 50,000, some folks on the smaller end, 1,000 to 6,000, medium sized. We've got one in the chat here, uh, customer service of 8. That is a small utility. Thanks for sharing that in the chat. Um, all right, looks like we've got mostly more than 50,000, couple folks who are not sure. And maybe we'll turn to our next poll. I know folks are still responding to that one in the interest of time. And then we're also curious, if you are a utility, how many folks do you have on staff? This helps us understand, the size of utilities that are interested in these topics and how we can provide technical assistance to folks in the best way. All right, couple less than 5. I'm sure you all are wearing many hats, some in between 26 and 50, mostly more than 50, which makes sense given the responses on the last poll. All right, so I know folks are still responding to this one as well, but to keep us moving, I'm going to pass it over to Jeff.
All right, I found the not mute button. Thanks so much for filling out those polls. It's always really interesting to us on the kind of panelist side to get a sense of who's out there in the audience, get a bit of a personality. So Jesse, if you want to pull up the next slide, we can start talking about what are natural assets. That's great. Hundreds, I love coastal lupins. We can probably move to the next one. Great. So as an initial matter, it's really important to be clear about what we mean by this term, natural assets, right? If you Google the term, you'll find a number of different definitions, some which apply to one portion of the water sector versus another. So we together have a project that's been supported by the Water Research Foundation to provide some resources about managing, valuing, and investing in natural assets. And so we worked with an advisory group of utility staff, people like you, across all the water sectors to start refining this definition, these multiple definitions, into a coherent, kind of comprehensive one. I think the important thing about this one that we've developed is it calls out some really specific elements. One, there's multiple benefits that are provided by these assets. They're not just specific to providing a particular water service. And these multiple benefits flow to multiple beneficiaries, utility, yes, but also the community and to the environment. And that they complement or replace. Those two things are important. Built infrastructure, right? So we see green assets, natural assets that exist alongside more engineered structures or are engineered structures, or that can be employed to take the place of more gray infrastructure. And also that they provide unique services, things that built infrastructure may not be able to provide. You can see a selection. There's 8 of these kind of types of natural assets that we'll be considering as we go through the rest of this presentation. It's not an exhaustive list, but it kind of hits some of the primary ones for the purpose of our study and for this discussion. So let's take a look at some examples just to kind of provide some details that flesh out this concept. So if you want to move to the next slide, Jesse, we can do that. We don't often think of natural assets as part of the wastewater treatment space, but there are many wastewater treatment plants that rely on constructed wetlands to provide final stage, treatments, polishing, or others that integrate constructed wetlands into their secondary and tertiary treatment trains. These wetlands obviously provide kind of a valuable water service, but they have natural functions that serve other purposes as well, like delivering wildlife or habitat or even recreational opportunities. I've been to the Clayton County Water Authority wetlands there in the bottom, and they're really a fascinating ecosystem. Let's move to the next slide, please. It's really more common to think about natural assets as watersheds that provide drinking water supply services, both in kind of the hydrographic functions that tributaries and mainstream rivers and creeks provide, but also the filtration and water quality security that benefits the utility through avoided filtration costs, avoided treatment costs, while providing these wide range of additional benefits. There's huge habitat, wildlife values, often recreational opportunities. One of the things that you'll start to we'll pick up throughout this conversation is that these values, these co-benefit values, are not really fully reflected in utility accounting or even investment strategies. We may see that these watersheds only have like real estate value instead of capturing the importance of the services that they provide to a utility and to the community. And that probably flows for the wastewater treatment wetlands as well. Let's take a look at a third example on the next slide. Green stormwater infrastructure, or GSI, obviously functions as engineered or constructed systems that rely on natural processes. They often kind of mimic nature to provide stormwater management services. They also deliver multiple benefits to urbanized communities, including kind of a heat island reduction or air quality improvements, even habitat and wildlife values in an urban setting. And these have quantifiable benefits to utilities and to the community, to the public, as well as to the environment. And I'm going to talk a little bit later in this presentation about how we can quantify some of those values. We'll do this for watersheds as well, and then kind of translate those values into management strategies and investment plans. We could go on to talk about examples of multi-purpose floodplains, especially when they're used to provide managed aquifer recharge, or riparian corridors that reduce thermal loads to rivers and streams. So you kind of get this kind of overall picture of this portfolio of natural assets that provide services to the water sector and the communities you all represent. Managing these assets as nodes of water infrastructure requires kind of intentional approaches to management frameworks as well as valuation. So with this background, I get to hand it over to Heather, who's going to walk us through some management approaches.
Thank you, Jeff. And on this slide, you will see the 3 of us who are going to talk about how to manage and value natural assets, myself, Bob, and then Janet. So next slide. So we manage gray assets. These are the man-made things like pipes, pumps, tanks, wells, etc., using a process called asset management. So next slide. And asset management involves 5 core concepts. And as we go through the next slide and the next several slides, we're going to talk very quickly about what these core components are. So the current state of the assets is the physical things that make up your system. So what are they, where are they, and what do you want to know about them? And next, the level of service is when we talk about what we want those assets to do, and we want to have goals that we can write and measure and report on. And next, then we want to think about criticality, and this is where we want to look at what assets are likely to fail and how bad is it if they do. So if they're very likely to fail and it's very bad consequences, they would be high risk. And if they were unlikely to fail and it wouldn't be a problem, that would be low risk. And that will help us decide where to spend our money. And next. Then we'll look at the life cycle of the assets and try to figure out where we want to intervene along that life cycle to have the lowest overall life cycle cost we can. And then finally, next slide, we will do long-term funding, which is what we're going to do to fund our utility sustainably over the long term. So next, so we talked about this process for gray assets. So our natural and green assets, really assets in the same sense as gray ones. So an asset is something that has actual or potential value. It's something that needs to be managed and it serves an intended purpose. So next. Do natural and green assets have value? So we can look at the cost of land, the plants, vegetation, other green or natural aspects of the overall asset. We can think about the cost of any gray components that might be included. So if we have an engineered green asset, we might have an inlet or under drain or something like that. And then the non-monetary values that are associated with these assets, which Jeff talked about, these social and environmental values that can also be important. So next. Then we might ask, are the green and natural assets intended to serve a particular purpose? And again, Jeff talked about some of these, and we'll just reiterate a few: stormwater management, so quantity and quality, having source water at all, like a river, a lake, something of that nature, conveying source water, again, which might be a river or a swale or some other thing, infiltration, so trying to get groundwater infiltrated, source water protection, infiltration, inflow reduction. And then, like I said, Jeff had mentioned several others. So next slide. And then it also has those secondary values. So the secondary values around the aesthetics, climate change considerations, health aspect, heat island effect, that sort of thing. So it has these other values in addition to the primary values. So next slide. And then we can ask the question, do natural and green assets require any management in order to serve their purpose? So we know that if we have green assets, we do have to do O&M. We may have to make repairs. And if they're natural assets, we might have to do rehabilitation. We might have to do stream bank restoration. We might have to do forest thinning, things like that. We don't necessarily replace natural assets, but we do replace green assets. And then we have to think about funding. So it would require some management to use green assets. Next, please. So if we can agree that these natural and green elements are assets, the next step is to incorporate those natural and green assets into the traditional asset management framework. So next. It is not a perfect fit, but it is our best option. And we really do want to consider green and gray on the same playing field. So we want to make sure that they do both get into the asset management framework so we can make choices about our overall process. But there are some considerations with natural and green assets. We're just going to go through very, very few of them here. So next, in the current state of the assets, we're going to have to think about how do we want to define an asset. It's way easier if we have a gray asset than a green asset. So that's something we have to think about, how we want to define those assets. So next slide. Then we have to think about in level of service, we do have both primary and secondary considerations around assets. So generally speaking, with gray assets, there's only one purpose. They're there for one thing only. And so with green, we can have both primary and secondary aspects, and we want to have goals around both of those. Next slide, please. And then with criticality, it could be a little bit different with green assets. So an asset or portion of an asset can fail, but the asset can still function. And then there's also multi-asset versus single asset failure. So we want to think about all those things that make it a little bit more difficult to decide what's failure and what's not. And next slide. And then with life cycle costing, the cost of the various life stages are difficult to estimate. With green, they're more difficult than they are with gray, but that will improve over time. So this isn't something we're stuck with. And what we're going to talk about, in some of the later parts of the webinar will also address some of these aspects. And natural assets don't have some of the costs. Generally, we're not purchasing it. It's like the forest is there, the river is there, and they won't be replaced per se. We're not going to literally take out a river and put a new river in there. So it's a little bit different with natural assets than what we think of with gray. And then green assets can be owned by different entities and manage them. And green assets can appreciate over time where gray assets depreciate. So some of our life cycle costing is a bit different with green and natural than it is with gray. And then next slide. So the last part of asset management, of course, is long-term funding. This is in its infancy with green and natural assets. And again, we're going to talk about some of those aspects today, about how to value these assets, especially natural assets. And it is hard to develop a long-term funding plan right now, but again, I believe this will improve in the future. And with natural assets, again, we're going to talk about how to value these in a bit later. And with green, construction costs are very site specific, which makes it difficult. Maintenance costs are not really well known, and we're still working on that. Operation costs are generally low to zero, but costs of repair, rehabilitation, replacement is something we do have to account for, and it does vary a bit from place to place, and end of life is difficult to estimate, especially with natural assets. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bob, who's going to take us kind of from a transition of management to valuing assets. So take it away, Bob.
Good. Thank you, Heather, and good day, everyone. A key point in thinking about natural assets is while Heather pointed out some of the ways that they're different, and she also pointed out the ways they are the same. And I think the statement in the green box here, really points to the what's important. It does not matter whether a service comes from an engineered asset or a natural asset. Matters is that that service is well provided, that it's reliable, sustainable, cost effective. And so we need to think about our natural assets in the same way we think about our built assets. And all of these assets, whether built or natural, can degrade or fail. And this degradation or failure poses a risk to the utility. It will adversely impact the level of service, and it's likely to impose some costs on the utility to repair or replace or do some sort of restoration. And typically, there are adverse impacts that extend beyond the utility to your rate-paying customers, other communities, and ecosystems. For example, if a wetland becomes terribly degraded or there's development that takes over a wetland, there are consequences that affect the utility and the water quality and the community as a whole. Next slide, please. And so we need to think about what risks we face when we look at our natural assets. What are the risks to the condition and the service levels that those assets provide? And without getting too complicated here, risk is defined as probability, the likelihood that something will occur, multiplied by the consequences. What would happen if that event takes place? And these consequences are driven by the costs that are imposed by asset failure or degradation. And they include the value of reduced level of service that you're obtaining from those natural assets. And you also need to include all the other adverse impacts that degradation or failure can impose. And the kind of colorful box on the left is just one of the simple ways you can think about risk in identifying and assessing risks. With uh, probability on the horizontal axis and though not labeled consequence on the vertical. And you can roughly place what could fail, whether it's a built asset or a natural asset, and kind of a sense of the range of the consequences as well. And then you need to think about, all right, we're facing these risks. What can we do to manage them? And we need to think about what are our options for managing those risks and think about the value of the wide range of benefits that come along with reducing those risks, including what costs we might avoid. Next slide, please. Um, so, once we've identified what risks we face from our natural assets and the risks to the associated level of services and other consequences, and we thought about how we might go about managing those risks, the next step is to, evaluate those risk management options and select the ones that you think are best. And, objective here is to maximize your net benefits. You want to get the most bang per buck that you can. And so we're looking at, when we say net benefits, we mean the degree to which the benefits outweigh the costs. And in order to do that sort of assessment, you need to understand what the value of the services are that you're obtaining from these natural assets and how those values are impacted through the risks that those assets face. And we also need to include in here the value of avoiding any other adverse consequences to the environment, to the community as a whole, and so on. So, that's a real critical link between asset management and valuation. Um, and then once you have ranked and identified what risk management option you wish to pursue, the next step is to actually invest in making that risk management solution, turning it into reality. And, so here we come to the issue of financing and financial reporting. Because to, invest in natural asset management means that you need to compete internally within the utility for capital funds and operating funds. And you also need to secure the financing to move forward and update your financial reporting to reflect the value that you're gaining from these assets as well as the costs. And with that, I'll turn it over to Janet to talk about valuation. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. So Heather obviously reviewed natural asset management. Bob provided some good context on natural asset management and the reason that how valuation can play into that, right? That's a key element of thinking about how to manage these assets. We need to know the value of them. That includes, information that can help you inform levels of service, for example, assess your risk. What happens if our natural assets degrade? What are the costs, the environmental, social, and financial costs? But thinking about valuation can also help you, prioritize investments when you're looking at that part of the asset management wheel. It can help you compete for scarce funding. So whether it's among your department or within your department or competing for grant dollars, for example, valuing the benefits associated with natural assets is also a good way to communicate. And it's also a good way to think about, we do a lot of work thinking about, well, how can these additional benefits that natural assets provide, bring in additional funders or bring in additional partners. So for all these reasons, we want to understand the value of our natural assets, ranging from, whether it's, like Jeff said, for drinking water supply down to wetlands. And we, if I had a dime for every time I've heard, well, if we could only quantify and value these things, whether it's green stormwater infrastructure or any type of these natural assets. And there's a whole host, what I have on the left-hand side of the screen here is there's a whole host of kind of terminology around valuation that can get confusing when you're not kind of steeped in this stuff and don't do this day to day. So if you want to go to the next slide, talk more about that. Jeff presented our list of kind of natural assets that are included in the Water Research Foundation project that we're working on collectively as a team here. And what this table here on the right-hand side is just shows the range of those assets. So those assets that he mentioned, and then the different benefits that they provide, right? Here we've broken them up in terms of, well, what kind of direct water management benefits can they provide? And what are what we're calling kind of environmental and social co-benefits. So kind of going back to that, there's all these terms and things, and then there's this big list of potential benefits. Well, how do we really identify which natural assets provide which benefits, and how do we actually put a value to things like air quality, urban cooling, et cetera? In many cases, those direct water management benefits are the things, as utilities and people working in the water utility space think about first, right? Those can be a little bit more straightforward than some of these other, what people often refer to as kind of squishy benefits. If you go to the next slide. So as part of the project that we're all collectively kind of working on, we developed a framework to help utilities navigate this kind of complex world and all these different benefits. What we learned in talking to different utilities is that everyone does want credible evaluation methods, and that can mean a lot of different things. So what we've done is what you see on the right-hand side of your screen is kind of a 10-step framework for walking through the different steps of thinking about or how to value your natural assets. One of the things going back to those water management benefits that I talked about, one of the things that people or utilities in our experience feel most comfortable with is, okay, well, what are we avoiding with these natural assets? What are the avoided costs? We have a good example of Clean Water Services in Oregon. They have a temperature regulation, and they decided to plant trees to provide shade over where they discharge and over streams to provide the benefit of shading, right? So trees provide that benefit. In their case, that avoided $50 million capital expenditure that would cool that water, their discharges prior to discharge in a different way. So that's a kind of a clear avoided cost, right? We often feel comfortable with those things. What our framework does is walks you through other approaches to valuing things like, well, what's a recreational benefit of a wetland? Economists have kind of tried and true approaches to look at, well, how much do people benefit in terms of, how much would they be willing to pay to recreate at a wetland? How many visits does this wetland support? So our framework kind of walks through those different different things. Next slide. I want to give you a quick example here because I know, it's a 10-step framework. Again, there's all these terms. It can get to be a lot. But I want to kind of just stress that, the extent of valuation and what you need to do really depends on your objective, right? If you just need to kind of justify an investment in natural assets, maybe all you do is need to value those avoided costs. Maybe if you want to be talking to the public, they're interested in a certain benefit or a certain co-funder. Maybe all you need to do is value that specific co-benefit. So it's not necessarily a $200,000 effort to kind of quantify and monetize these benefits. This is an example from Clean Water Services, and this is actually a tool that Bob helped them build. They used some, what you see on the left-hand side of your screen is just a snapshot of an Excel spreadsheet that shows on the left-hand side, various benefits that natural assets, in this case, they're looking at the value of wetlands that natural assets can provide. And they took these values directly from a toolkit developed by FEMA, which it's kind of an ecosystem services benefits toolkit. They publish values for wetlands on a per acre basis. And Clean Water Services says, okay, here's our acres of wetlands. We apply the FEMA values. They are also able to scale the benefits based on, this wetland is currently at about 20% functioning. When we restore it, it'll go to about 90%. So they kind of scale the benefits that way. So a very simple example of integrating existing values to look at the value of your natural assets. And I'm going to end there. And I'm going to pass it off to Ed to talk about how these types of valuation and asset management all play a role in investing and accounting for natural assets.
Thanks so much, Janet. And so obviously from this discussion and the fact that you're here, we all believe that natural assets can provide some value. And so the point is, how do you spend the money you need to spend to make sure that you maximize that value? And we're not saying just natural, green, gray, a mix of the things that you need to do to make your organization and your utility run. Next slide. The basic idea is that you don't get a lot of scaled up large value assets unless you do it through a regular multi-year capital plan. The idea of putting money, a little bit of money every year as an expense in your regular budget doesn't get you there. So you really need to talk about what are those major capital plans that you do, tend to be 5-year, 10-year plans. And when you look at those, when all is said and done, you don't normally have enough money in your rate base to fund all those with cash. So most of those are debt funded. So you know that these are important, you can debt fund them, and you want to put them in a multi-year capital plan. So next slide, what's the problem? We made the decision. Everything's just fine. We're going to go talk to our finance people, our engineers. It's all going to work out. Next slide. Not always. So when you go to the next slide, it talks about, the things that we've heard when we've talked to people about, why can't you invest in this natural asset just the same as you would in a treatment plant? And the idea is like, well, yeah, but debt, borrowing money, I don't like borrowing money at all. Or it's, I just don't like debt. Or I know you've given me the rules that allow us to do this, but it doesn't feel right to me to do it. Or it's not really part of the water system since I don't own it. And how does that work? Or it's a turf buyback program. It's just grass. How can that be an asset for me? So you go through and you hear a lot of different things, a lot of them from finance people. And so part of this short presentation is to give you an idea of how you can respond and talk to your finance folks. Next slide. So the good news is that you can meet accounting rules and you can meet IRS rules and you can borrow money to finance investments in natural assets, whether you own them or not. There's different ways to do it, and we'll go through them very, very briefly in the next couple of slides. Next. So, why? Why would you do this? Well, the first thing, it is practical. By and large, most people do not have a rate base that allows them to do major capital investments just out of cash. They tend to have to go to the state revolving funds, issue debt, a variety of things to be able to make this work. But it's also the right thing to do, because what it does when you borrow money and then pay it back over time on a long-lived asset, you are matching costs with benefits. And so what you're doing is you're saying, gee, the people who live here today should not pay all of the costs for an asset that will provide value for the next 20, 30 or more years. You should spread those costs over the time period for when the people will get the benefit. And that's what that matching cost and benefits. And issuing debt and then paying debt over time makes that difference. You have really low cost loans at times. We work with state revolving funds where the interest rate is 1%, 2%, and just the regular cost of living inflation is 3%. So it's almost free money in many, many cases to go out and get this money for long-term loans. The other part is the intergenerational equity, and that's the part, again, where we should not be paying for the benefits in the future, but we should also not be saddling our grandchildren paying for the benefits that we're enjoying now. So to borrow money now, pay it off every year, and pay it off over the life of an asset is a really practical and also correct way to do things. Next slide. So how do you make this work? So the first thing is, as we talked about, for the asset management system for valuation, you have to start with what's important. So look at those things first. Classify natural assets in your thinking and your finance people's thinking as the same as regular things. You can expense some small things, but they're capital expenditures for large, ongoing, major assets. You can use rates or bonds or loans to finance them just like any other capital spending. And that's the point we keep making, is you should treat this as just one of your options for how you take care of your utility. And you can book this debt either way. What we say is a traditional approach, and most of your accountants are familiar with that. That's where you own an asset, or you own it maybe through a maintenance agreement or an easement or something else, and then it's easy to put that on the books. You spend the money, you put it on the books. There's also a way that regulated operations, regulated utilities, like pretty much everybody here, I'm sure, that's water and wastewater utilities, where you have someone who sets a rate structure for you, either your own bond or board, or some outside board sets the rates, and you can set rates for the future to pay back debt. If you can do that, you can record that idea that you've spent $100 million on restoring an asset or a watershed in a national park. You can put that on your books as a receivable for the debt you're going to be collecting over the next 20 years. So you end up with a debt, but you also end up with you end up with an asset, and that makes your finance people much more happy. And there's ways to do it even if you don't own those assets. And then, of course, right now we are stuck with recording things at historical cost, even though you've heard from Janet and others that there's other ways of talking about value. Next slide. So you want to include this investment in any kind of budgeting process. So your 5-year capital plans, your cost of service studies, you should also always be looking at, this is the life cycle cost of a treatment plant. This is the life cycle cost of this alternative. What makes the most sense over time for your utility to take care of this? We've also said there's all these other economic benefits which don't fit nicely into accounting documents. It's hard to show those on your regular books. It's not hard to show them at all in terms of bond financial statements, where you're going out and looking at bond official statements and saying, this is what our utility does. This is the value we place on the kinds of activities we do. Those are not historical costs. Those can be real value that you've done from economic analysis. In addition to that, even though your ACFR or your annual financial reporting has certain requirements, there's also portions of that where you can do voluntary disclosure. And in that voluntary disclosure, you can talk about these assets that add value and the value that you put on them as an organization to make sure that you can do what you need to do. Next slide. And back to Caroline Koch, who will be talking about technical assistance we're providing. Thank you.
Thanks, Ed, and thanks everyone for that overview. So now that we know what natural assets are and how to manage value and invest in them, I'm going to talk a little bit about the resources EFCN and WaterNow have available, so you can actually follow through on some of these ideas. But first, on our next slide here, just to be clear, you can use Clean Water State Revolving Fund loans to pay for a variety of these types of natural asset projects that we've been talking about. And these projects do and should qualify for what is called the Green Project Reserve, which sets aside at least 10% of the federal capitalization grants states receive for these types of green projects. And qualifying for that set aside really can help make these natural assets more competitive in those SRF processes, which can be quite competitive. So I'll share just a couple of examples of what I mean here. So in fiscal year 2027, Milwaukee Metropolitan Sewage District, for example, received a $12 million loan to pay for their green infrastructure incentives program. So this means that the utility is using this SRF loan to pay for their GSI incentives that install these projects on property that the utility doesn't own, just as Ed was talking about. Um, in 2019, the city of Flagstaff received a $6 million loan to help finance its watershed health and wildfire mitigation projects. So I saw a question in the Q&A box about, watersheds being a natural asset. As you can see for Flagstaff, that is one of their natural assets, their watershed. And in 2026, Mosier, Oregon received a $1.5 million SRF loan to pay for a range of GSI investments. And I highlight this one as an example of a pretty small community of about 500 residents that are leveraging SRFs for their natural asset projects. So on our next slide, with that understanding that you can use SRFs for these types of investments, but we know that accessing those funds is not always straightforward. So that's why we have the specialized assistance to access those dollars, especially for small rural and tribal systems. So who are those systems? We can see on our next slide. So the assistance is available to wastewater and stormwater systems that serve populations of less than 10,000 or wastewater systems that treat up to 1 million gallons per day. And so those systems can be run by cities, towns, bureaus, counties, parishes, special districts, associations, tribes, or other public agencies. So a pretty broad category there within those size constraints. As to the types of assistance that we're talking about, we can see on our next slide, it's going to also include a broad range of topics, all of which are aimed at ensuring these small systems are ready again to apply for water infrastructure funds. So, for example, agencies can get help with an actual funding application, or if you need help getting ready to be eligible, like getting an internal asset and utility management protocols, Heather and her team might be available to help you develop those asset management systems. We can also support systems with public engagement strategies to strengthen public trust and provide some customized trainings for boards and officials. And as we also saw in the Q&A box, those partnerships are particularly important for these natural asset investments that cross jurisdictions and require public-private partnerships and community buy-in. So on our next slide, if you're coming into this process, you can expect a dedicated team to work with you through a step-by-step assessment of your needs and priorities, and then a tailored approach to the resources and guidance that your system will need in particular, again, to be ready or to actually apply for those funds. How do you access this assistance? It's pretty easy. We've made it as easy as we can. So on our next slide, all you have to do is fill out this very short form. We're going to ask you for information that you have readily available, like your name, your title, your phone number, email, the name of your system, um, where your system is, your city and state, and then just a couple of information about what types of challenges you're facing and the support that you're looking for. Should take less than 5 minutes to fill that out. And then on our next slide here, I'll just talk about, in addition to this technical assistance for small, rural, and tribal systems, I'll highlight WaterNow's Project Accelerator program, which provides pro bono support for public water agencies, including stormwater, wastewater, and drinking water, to jumpstart an innovative water management project. So through the accelerator, cities and utilities can get help with program design and management, policy and legal analysis, stakeholder outreach, again, communications, really a wide range of support to help you get those projects off the ground. And one additional resource that I'll highlight for now is WaterNow and River Network's Building Blocks of Trust training. So this program provides some off-the-shelf materials, as well as the potential for in-person or virtual trainings on how cities, utilities, and their community partners can operationalize the 8 building blocks of trust that you can see here on the slide that are designed to help folks form trust-based, authentic relationships. The online training that we've developed is a good place to start on this particular resource. So I'll put the link to that in the chat in a moment. But we have now reached our audience Q&A section. And I know we've had lots of conversation in the Q&A box, and thanks, Jeff, for sharing those responses to folks. I'll invite everyone to come back on camera. And I know we've got a couple pending questions here. So there's one about, do you have examples where rates were set or additional fees added to customer service charges that included natural asset valuation? So if I'm understanding this question, they're curious if payment just for natural assets have been added as a special fee or rate.
Can I just add one
Sure.
case where maybe not precisely what you're talking about, but pretty close to that is the case of Central Arkansas Water, where they were going to protect their watershed because it was facing development pressures. They were very concerned that their source water would be impacted and very negatively impacted. So they added a fee to their bill that was just specifically for that purchase of land and that protection. And that land was basically a green asset because they were trying to keep it natural and in a conservation sort of state. So they started out with, I think, like 49 cents was the original. And then I think they went up to like 60 something cents per month per customer. And then I think they ultimately ended up with about 99 cents. And all that money was used for that source water protection, which would be green and natural assets. So I think that is one case where that did occur.
Yeah, thanks, Heather. I think that was the one that was coming to mind for me. And um, the city of Tucson has also adopted a dedicated fee to fund their green infrastructure investments. It is akin to a stormwater fee, but it is used only for green infrastructure, if I'm remembering correctly. But Ed, I see you going off mute because you might have some thoughts about this.
Well,
Yeah.
I think what you'll also find is you'll find people sometimes putting it on as a marketing technique. So people like the idea of conservation or green infrastructure kind of things. And so sometimes people put a special surcharge on saying 50 cents or 65 cents or whatever a month, or a certain amount per gallon or per cubic feet. That's great, and that's a great marketing thing. You don't need to do any of that. You can simply put it in your regular rate structure. And there, I think, was it Albuquerque that used to have a separate rate, and now they've just rolled it back into the regular rate structure because once people got over that idea of yes, we're paying for all these things along with what we used to pay for, it made very little sense to kind of say, was this going to be in this pot or this pot? It's all part of your infrastructure. It's all part of your how you run your utilities. So you might start with some kind of special fee. Again, from a marketing perspective, you don't need to do it from a financial perspective.
Yeah, thanks, Ed. And that gets back to what Bob was talking about. This is just part of the level of service that the water system is providing. So including it in your regular rate making uh, is how you can pay for it. Any other thoughts on that question? Awesome. Well, Jeff, I know you're responding to some of the questions in writing, but did any stand out to you as one that folks want to chime in on as well?
I think there are always interesting additional examples of where natural assets are proving to be kind of cost competitive or more effective in providing the water service. So if the panel wants to chime in with their favorite examples, I think folks would probably appreciate it. And then we had a little bit of a conversation about aquifers as a natural asset. I think if there's any further question on that, that'd be great. And yeah, and then Kenneth, I want to call you out a little bit. Like we talked a little bit about like the durability of natural assets and how they may be well-intentioned, they may be, a design and project strategy to provide a system, but they can be subject to kind of different vulnerabilities or the same vulnerabilities that gray infrastructure systems have. So that kind of bears on the need to kind of invest in planning, implementation, design to really help these systems survive increasing environmental challenges.
And I just wanted to mention that there isn't really a limit to what you can call an asset. It's really a very system specific thing. So if an aquifer is a very important asset to you, and then that then leads you to what do you need to preserve in addition to the aquifer itself, like you need to preserve land that will allow water to infiltrate the aquifer and protect your well and that sort of thing. So you can be as expansive as you want. It's the reason that I would like including green and natural assets in an overall strategy is again to view this as a collective whole. So it's this whole collection of green, gray, natural assets that fulfill the service needs for your customers. And so the more expansive you can be and the more you can be thinking about managing these assets and taking care of them, the better off you're going to
Yeah.
be. So there isn't a limit to you can or can't include it. You can include whatever you want. And the more expansive you are, the better protected you will be in the future, the better sustainable and resilient and all these things. And you can always make changes over time, adding things or changing how you manage things. So it's not, again, like a once and done, like, oops, I wish I would have put that in. Now I'm stuck. No, you put it in. If it wasn't there before, you can put it in later. And I think somebody had mentioned, like, what do you do with a forest, including it as an asset, like the whole watershed or just part of it. And again, you can start out one way and choose to do it another. One utility we worked with had put like each individual tree in an area in their assets and decided that was just way too difficult to manage and then changed it to trees as just an asset. So we didn't have to have individual trees. It's like trees is one asset and the dirt was another asset and the underdrains was a third asset, et cetera. So you can change things over time if it's not working for you. Again, this is a very flexible learn as you go process. So don't be afraid to try things. And if they don't work, just make the adjustment that you need to make.
Yeah, and I'd just like to add to Heather's response is, there's a lot of, challenging aspects to doing this kind of work with natural assets, and you don't have to do it all at once. It's a journey. And as the old proverb says, every journey begins with a single step. So, just by starting to identify, how do natural assets play into the services we provide, and what would happen if something changed with them. You can iterate back and fill in the details. I love the story of them trying to do every tree and then realizing that was a bit of an overreach. So you know uh, expect that it'll take some time and it will take effort, but you don't have to do it all at once. It's a journey.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, Ed, did you have a thought on that one?
Just on caches on the next question.
Yeah, please
I know Jeff's
tell
typing an
us.
answer, but the basic idea, it's always been pretty easy actually to go ahead and spend money on O&M costs, whether you own the property or not. Much more difficult than for capitalizing those costs. Unless there's some specific regulation that's internal to your organization and a charter or rule, you can spend this kind of money, and it makes perfect sense. I mean, the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission spends millions of dollars every year with the National Park Service to take care of the watershed that we have in Yosemite National Park. And there's multiple examples of where we're saying, this clearly adds value. We clearly don't own it, but we want to share the cost with you to make sure that you maintain it in a way that works for our systems. And you can find those everywhere. Just the SFPUC one with Yosemite is one of the examples.
Yeah, thanks, Ed. And I see we had a question in the chat as well of available assistance. So I'll echo Jeff's comment. Just reach out to us and we'll figure out what we can do. But on the note about clean water SRF, particularly in Colorado, being eligible or other types of entities being eligible, we have heard from the SRF administrators that they are interested in funding these types of watershed health wildfire projects in particular, and they are flexible in how that works. So having a public agency partner or some other type of arrangement, we can talk with you about that. You have there's some flexibility.
Yeah.
I'll just say it that way.
Yeah,
Um,
and I was going to say they're often kind of programs through the U.S. Department of Agriculture as well for conservation, tillage, and things where farming practices in particular, can be a threat to riparian corridors, wetlands, and so on. So, that's a place where you can either get funding or work with whoever owns and is using that natural asset to engage in practices that are helpful for the utility services.
And I would just echo
Excellent. Well,
real quick, I
Heather,
would just echo Caroline that please reach out if you have any needs and we'll try to figure out how we can help you.
yes, thank you, Heather. And I know we have more questions in the Q&A box, so we can follow up offline, but feel free to reach out to us as well, as Heather mentioned. Just a few closeout things here as we reach the end of our hour together. I encourage our public agency, public utility folks to join WaterNow. It's free membership and it gets you access to lots of resources and our network. As a reminder, please let us know how we're doing on these trainings. We'll put the survey link in the chat. And thank you again to all of our panelists. It's really fun working with this team on these issues, and I'm glad we could share that work with you all this afternoon, this morning. And we hope that you all have a wonderful rest of your day. Thanks for joining.
Bye, everyone.